There are much expectations for the world's two largest economies to iron out the ongoing trade tensions. In the past few months, trade frictions between China and the United States continue. The Trump administration has threatened to impose tariffs on up to $150 billion of Chinese imports, while China has vowed to retaliate against U.S. exports if the Trump administration moves forward with the tariffs. Some experts say that one of the major reasons that prompted Trump to send a delegation to China is because of his American First policies, which not only facing criticism in the U.S. but also around the world.
The European Union just launched a statement about the U.S. the extension of exemption of steel and aluminum tariffs against the European Union. U.S. has extended the temporary exemption, but the European Union seems not satisfied with this issue. European Union is putting a lot of pressure on United States, which means American first policy is troubles at the international level.
The members of the U.S. delegation were announced earlier this week and include U.S. Secretary Stephen Mnuchin and U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer. And experts say the high-profile group not only reflects the great importance the U.S. government is placing on the trade talk, but also the Trump administration's various stances on China.
When we look at the composition of the delegation coming here to negotiate, I think we can interpret this as a bureaucratic turf battle in that all of the factions in the United States government, in the Trump administration, want a seat at the table. So we of course have Peter Navarro, who is an extreme China hawk, to Larry Kudlow, who is more of a classic Republican free trader, to Steve Mnuchin, who is, I think, more in the camp of engage with China. I think every faction sees the importance of this question and wants a seat at the table and a voice in these discussions.
China's foreign ministry said one day ahead of the meeting that China welcomes the move and said as long as the U.S. is sincere, both sides can have constructive trade talks. Some experts say that for issues as complicated as this one, it is hard to come up with specific and concrete measures within just a couple of days' visit. However, what is important is the tone that will be set from the meeting, which will help to pave the way for the future China-U.S. economic ties. So Yun, CGTN, Beijing.
Right then, so let's dig deeper into the talks. What should we expect? What opportunities arise out of this crisis? Chelsea Markowitz is a researcher at the Economic Diplomacy Programme at the South African Institute of International Affairs. She joins us now live from Johannesburg. Thank you for your time, Chelsea. Given how far apart these two sides are on many issues, should we expect any compromises at this meeting by both sides, or should we be expecting no results at all?
Well, I don't think there will be any major agreements or compromises that will come out of this. As we know, this has escalated very quickly, and there hasn't been much time on either side to prepare. These meetings came up very quickly. I think that China has shown that on a couple issues they are willing to make some concessions, although this isn't much different than what they had been saying before these issues really came up. So on some issues relating to market access for U.S. companies, tariffs particularly in the automotive industry, also on purchasing more imports from the U.S. So these are some of the things that have been spoken about. However, it's been quite vague in terms of what actually could be agreed upon. And I think what would most likely come out of this is essentially agreements to continue talking. And essentially what would be ideal is to stave off or buy time with the proposed tariffs, which would be implemented next month. So essentially neither party really wants these to be implemented ultimately. So in order to essentially prolong the talks and prolong these tariffs from being implemented would essentially be ideal. However, given the divergence within the delegation that's coming from the U.S. in terms of their views on the issue, it's really not certain how the result will be.
Indeed. So let's assume, for the sake of argument, that this does escalate into a full-blown actual trade war. How can economies like South Africa, where you are, how can they position themselves to benefit from the fallout? Is there any competitive advantage that economies like Ethiopia, Kenya, Egypt, South Africa, to which we've all seen a lot of offshore manufacturing move, can they bring any competitive advantage to the table?
So what I first want to emphasize with this is that if a full-blown trade war were to occur, which I don't think is extremely likely, overall there would not be significant benefits for everyone, because obviously this would cause a contraction globally in terms of economies all over the world. And China being Africa's biggest trading partner, this would have impacts on the costs of finished goods coming into African countries, as well as intermediate goods for the industrial development of these countries within Africa. So I first want to emphasize that point. But if this were to ultimately happen, there would be some domestic industries, particularly in South Africa, maybe more than other countries, given that the productive capacity is higher in South Africa, that might be able to benefit in terms of exports to China in particular. So an example of this might be in the horticulture industries and fruit and nuts, as well as wine, one of South Africa's biggest exports. So there might be some small advantages here, but overall the impact economically would be negative. In some of the other countries that you mentioned, so Ethiopia, textiles is a competitive industry there. We don't know if there's a full trade war, which industries would be affected if the tariffs were increased and more industries were included, so we can't say for sure. But also in Kenya, as you mentioned, I think, horticulture is competitive as well. But we really can't say for sure in terms of the ability to take advantage of these opportunities that could arise. And overall, the impact, though, would be much more negative than positive in terms of increased protectionism.
Indeed, fairly comprehensive answer there. Thank you for that. That's Chelsea Markowitz there from the South African Institute of International Affairs.